Welcome back, everyone. This video is going to continue our investigation of Descartes' meditations by looking a little bit more deeply at the Cogito and this really strange passage in Descartes about a piece of wax. It may seem weird, but this passage is actually incredibly important to understanding what Descartes is doing. So here's a preview of what we'll do in this video. We're going to review what the Cogito is. We're going to look at how that relates to Descartes' views on our knowledge of our own minds. We'll talk about a distinction between accidental and essential properties. We'll talk about the wax example. What is it? And what's the point of it? And then we'll look at sort of the lessons that Descartes wants to draw from this conversation. So remember, towards the beginning of the second meditation, Descartes finally arrives at a belief that he thinks is immune, sort of survives all possible doubt. So his method of doubt has finally revealed a belief so strong that he can't find any reason to doubt it. And this is what we call the cogito, the belief, I am, I exist. Why does that belief survive every single doubt from the first meditation? The idea is you need to exist in order to even have the thought that you exist. Even if you're dreaming, even if there's an evil genius deceiving you, anytime you have the thought, I exist, that thought must be true. So our knowledge of our own existence, this cogito, is supposed to teach us something important about sort of our own sort of understanding of ourselves. To see this, we need to distinguish between accidental properties. So this is a property or feature that something has, but which it could exist without. So here's an example. I have brown hair. This is an accidental property of me, since I could exist without brown hair. If I go dye my hair purple tonight, I would still exist, but my brown hair would no longer be there. An essential property, though, is a property or feature that something has which it could not exist without. So this property is sort of definitive of that kind of thing. So an example here, a square has four sides. That is an essential property, since that square could not exist without that feature. If it didn't have four sides, it would no longer be a square. So at this point, Descartes says he knows that he exists. I am, I exist. But now we might sort of wonder, well, what is he? What is this thing that he knows exists? What does this knowledge amount to? What is it that he knows exists? Well, he says, look, I am not that concatenation of members we call the human body, for I've supposed that these things may be nothing. The assumption still stands. Yet nevertheless, I am something. I exist. Most certainly, in the strict sense, the knowledge of this I, so of my own existence, does not depend upon things whose existence I do not yet know. So he's pointing out, I know that I exist, but I don't yet know that my body exists. Descartes appears to be suggesting that having a body is not one of his essential properties. He would still exist even if it turned out that he was merely imagining his body due to an evil genius. But that just raises the question, so this is what his knowledge is not. But what is his knowledge and what is it that he knows exists? What is this I or self? What am I? A thing that thinks. What's that? A thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, and that also imagines and senses. Thought exists. It alone cannot be separated from me. I am, I exist. This is certain. But for how long? For as long as I am thinking. And again, it's the thought that makes him sort of certain that he exists. He says, but perhaps it could come to pass that if I were to cease all thinking, I would then utterly cease to exist. So the idea is his knowledge of his own existence comes from the fact that he has thoughts, not from the fact that he has a body, because he doesn't know that he has a body yet. He could just be imagining it. So Descartes appears to be suggesting that thought, or his mind, is what is essential to him. So at this point you might ask, but do I know anything else about this mind or this thought, other than that it exists? Well, Descartes says, but isn't it the same I, the same mind that now doubts almost everything, who understands something, who affirms that this one thing is true, who denies other things, who wants to know more, who wishes not to be deceived, who imagines many things even against my will, who also notices many things which appear to come from the senses? What is there in all of this that is not every bit as true as the fact that I exist, even if I'm always asleep or even my creator makes every effort to mislead me? So the idea here is, look, I believe that there's a computer screen in front of me. Now, Descartes points out, but I could be dreaming that computer screen. Okay, so my belief could be wrong, but it would still be true that I believe it. And it'd still be true that I have the experience of a computer screen in front of me. Take my mathematical beliefs as well. Even if one of my mathematical beliefs is wrong, maybe an all-powerful demon sort of tricks me into thinking that some mathematical claim is true even though it's not, I would still know that I have that belief, that I have that thought. So Descartes is suggesting that I can be certain not just that the mind exists, I can also be certain about what the mind is doing or thinking about. So I can know that my mind believes certain things, that I believe 2 + 2 = 4. I know that I can doubt certain things. I know that my mind is willing something, that it wants something, it desires something. I know that my mind is imagining certain things and not others. And when properly understood, I know what my mind is sensing, because these are all ways that my mind is thinking. So Descartes also says, I now see a light, I hear a noise, I feel a heat. He says, these things may be false, since I may be asleep. I can't rule that out. But he says, even if I might be asleep right now, I certainly do seem to see these things, hear these things, and feel the warmth. So right now I see a computer screen in front of me. Maybe that computer screen is just a dream. But it's still true that I seem to see a computer screen in front of me. I seem to feel it when I touch it. That cannot be false. He says, properly speaking, this is what in me is called sensing. But this, precisely so taken, is nothing other than thinking. So let's get clear on what's going on in this passage. Let's think about how we usually think about perception. So this is a picture of what's called the direct realist view of perception. Sometimes it's called the naive realist view of perception because some people think it's naive. So we usually think, look, there's a world out there, there's me, so there's the sort of sun, and I sort of open my eyes and I see a tree in front of me. Usually we think that I just sort of directly sense the tree. So what I sense, the colors and shapes I see, those are the tree. I just directly see the tree in front of me when I open my eyes. But let's think about a sort of scientific story here that might give us a different picture of how perception works. The sun sort of reflects light off of a tree, and that light then hits our eyes. Well, what happens when that light hits our eyes? Well, it sends certain, say, signals to our brain, and that signal then creates an experience of the tree. A picture of the tree pops up in my mind as a result of this long process of light reflecting off the tree. So Descartes is saying, look, this is not what sensing is. It's not just seeing the tree. In perception, what happens is the light reflects off, and when I see the tree, what I sense is this image that pops up in my mind, this impression that the tree makes on my mind. Descartes in the second meditation is saying, but I don't know that the tree actually exists outside my mind because it could just be a dream, or that image in my mind could just be the result of an evil genius. So I usually think that there's a tree outside my mind, but I don't know that. But it's not just the tree. That applies to the sun too. The sun could just be a dream. Similarly, even the ground could just be a dream. And so I don't know that it exists outside my mind. Moreover, even my hands, my feet, my head, my body, that too could just be a dream. Descartes in the second meditation is saying, look, I know that my mind, the little thought bubble, that exists. And I know everything that's happening in my mind. I seem to see a tree. I seem to see my hands. I seem to see my legs. But I don't know if any of those things exist outside of my mind yet. Descartes now arrived at this idea that what he knows and understands best is his own mind, its thoughts, and its experiences. But he has an almost irresistible temptation to think that physical things, whose images are formed by thought and which the senses themselves examine, are much more distinctly known than this mysterious I, which does not fall within the imagination. So Descartes in the second meditation, he's gone through this method of doubt and he's arrived at this idea that he has knowledge of this sort of thought bubble, his mind existing, and he has knowledge of the things that are going on in his mind. Now, he also believes that the tree that he seems to see in his mind exists outside of his mind. But he says what he's certain of is his mind and what's going on in it. That's what he knows best. But the tree outside of his mind, he's unsure of. He doesn't know that as well. despite the fact that he thinks he's sort of cleared up this sort of thinking so as to see why he understands his mind better than the sort of outside world, he can't help but sort of be tempted by the sort of alternative. He's tempted to think that what he really knows best is the physical objects, the things he sees, feels, touches. And what's mysterious or hard to understand is his mind. So Descartes brings up this example of a piece of wax. He says, okay, usually I tend to think that what I know best are physical objects. So let's just go with this for a moment. Let's try to think about those physical objects that I tend to think that I know so well, that I think I understand the best. And so he picks up a piece of wax and he uses his senses to try to learn everything he can about it and to understand the nature of physical objects like it. So he uses his senses to inspect the wax, and he notices it has a honey flavor using his taste. He notices it has the scent of a flower using smell. He sees that it has a specific shape. He can use sight or touch to notice that. He finds it has a specific size using his sight and touch. He finds it has a specific color using his sight. He uses his touch to notice that it's hard. He uses his touch to notice that it's cold. And he sort of flicks it and uses his hearing to notice that it makes a sound when it's hit. So Descartes has used all of his senses to see what they can teach him about the wax. But now, he moves the wax towards the heat of the fire that's near him, and what happens? Well, the wax melts. And all those features, all those things he saw, tasted, touched, smelled, they change. It loses that flavor of honey, loses the smell of flowers. It changes shapes, changes size, changes color. It's no longer hard, it's now soft. It's no longer cold, it's now hot. And when he flicks it, it no longer makes that sound. Descartes then asks, is it still the same piece of wax? Is it still the same physical object? He says, of course it is. Physical objects can change each of these properties. They can change their color, their size, their shape, their smell, without ceasing to exist. But then Descartes reflects on the question, what is the nature or essence of this wax then? What is the nature or essence of physical objects that he thought he understood so clearly? He says, it can't be any of those sensible properties, any of the things my senses told me about, because the wax can lose those features and still exist. Those things that my senses told me about the wax, those were merely accidents of the wax. Those weren't the sort of essence of the wax. Descartes thinks the only answer can be that extension, so taking up space, is an essential property of the wax. So the wax is just an object that takes up space, and it can sort of transform to take up different amounts of space in different shapes and different colors and different smells. But it couldn't stop having extension without ceasing to exist altogether. So Descartes thinks that the essential property of physical objects is extension. But where do we get this supposed knowledge? Where do we get this understanding of physical objects, such as the piece of wax? Descartes thinks there's three potential answers for where we might get knowledge. You might think that we get our knowledge about the wax from our senses. Or you might think we get our knowledge from the imagination. Or you might think that we get it from our reason. Which of these three faculties of our mind gives us the knowledge of this wax or of physical objects? And this leads to his wax argument. He says, look, I have an understanding, I have an idea of physical objects, such as a piece of wax. But my understanding idea, it either comes from my senses, imagination, or reason. But my understanding and my idea couldn't come from my senses, because notice, the senses only tell me about the accidental features of the wax, of those features that it could lose and still be the same thing. Maybe I get my idea, maybe I get my understanding from the imagination. Even if I see a particular size or shape, I can imagine the wax taking different shapes. I can imagine the wax taking different colors, having different smells. So maybe my understanding of what the wax is comes from my imagination. But Descartes says, but no. You can imagine some of the shapes that the wax could take, some of the smells it could have, some of the colors. But how many shapes could the wax take? It could take an infinite amount of shapes. Can you imagine in your mind not just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shapes that the wax could take? Can you imagine every single shape that it could possibly possess? Can you imagine an infinite amount of shapes? Because your idea of the wax, your understanding of it, includes that information that it could take any of those shapes. And he says you can't imagine all those possible shapes that form your understanding of the wax, and so your imagination cannot give you that understanding. He says, thus, the only thing left is the understanding must come from my reason. So Descartes thinks there are various lessons we can thereby learn from the cogito and the wax example that are going to help us sort of climb out of that skeptical hole that we dug with those first meditation doubts. The first lesson he thinks we should take from this is that we know our own minds and thoughts better than we know physical objects. And because of that, it's the beliefs about our own minds and ideas that need to form the foundation of our knowledge rather than beliefs about physical objects. Because the evil genius raises doubts about the existence of physical objects, but not about the existence of our own mind. Our knowledge of physical objects also presupposes knowledge of our minds. He says, look, I'm not aware of the wax itself. That's not what I sense. What I sense is, remember, that impression that the physical object makes on my mind. To make an impression on my mind must exist. So I must reason then from my knowledge of the idea existing in my mind to the conclusion that this impression that I sense in my mind is caused by a physical object outside me. That's the only way to get knowledge of a physical object. So all my knowledge of physical objects also includes and relies on my knowledge of my own mind. Right. Lesson number 2 then. He thinks the foundations of our knowledge consist of truths we learn from our reason rather than truths we learn from our senses. So my knowledge of my own existence can't come from my senses. I have knowledge of my own existence even when the evil genius hypothesis raises doubts about my senses. So my senses seem to tell me about my hands, my legs, my head, my body. But all those things could be a dream. Whatever my knowledge is of my own existence, it can't be coming from my senses, because my senses tell me about things that are thrown into doubt. So Descartes thinks our knowledge of our own existence comes from our reason rather than our senses. And in the wax example, according to Descartes, as we've seen, it seems that my knowledge and idea of what the wax is and the nature of physical objects needs to come from my reason rather than my senses. So that second lesson then is just Descartes rejecting empiricism in favor of rationalism. That's it for this video. See you next time.